This is part 7, Discourse in Man's Being, of chapter 9, Man and His Doubles, of Michel Foucault's The Order of Things. It may be observed that these 4 theoretical segments, analysis of finitude, of empirico-transcendental repetition, of the unthought, and the origin, stand in a certain relation to the 4 subordinate domains which together constituted the general theory of language in the classical age. A relation which is at first glance one of resemblance and symmetry. It will be remembered that the theory of the verb explained how language could overflow its own boundaries and affirm being, in a movement which, in return, assured the very being of language. Since the latter could establish itself and open up its space only where there already existed, at least in a hidden form, a foundation provided by the verb to be. The analysis of finitude explains in the same way how man's being finds itself determined by positivities, which are exterior to it and which link it to the density of things, but how, in return, it is finite being that gives any determination the possibility of appearing in its positive truth. Whereas the theory of articulation showed how the patterning of words and of the things they represent could occur without a hiatus between them, the analysis of the empirico-transcendental reduplication shows how what is given in experience and what renders experience possible correspond to one another in an endless oscillation. The quest for the primary designations of language drew out from the silent and innermost heart of words, syllables, and sounds themselves, a dormant representation that formed, as it were, their forgotten soul, which it was necessary to bring back to light, to make speak and sing once more, in order to attain a greater exactitude of thought, a more miraculous power of poetry. In a similar way, for modern thought, the inert density of the unthought is always inhabited in a certain manner by a cogito, and this thought, dormant within what is not thought, must be brought to life again and stretched out in the sovereignty of the I think. Lastly, there was a theory of derivation in classical reflection on language. This showed how language, from the beginning of its history and perhaps in the instant of its origin, at the very point when it began to speak, shifted inside its own space, pivoted around on itself away from its primary representation, and deposited its words, even the very oldest of them, only when they had already been deployed in the figures of rhetoric. Corresponding to that analysis, we now find the effort to conceive of an ever-elusive origin, to advance towards that place where man's being is always maintained in relation to man himself, in a remoteness and a distance that constitute him. But this play of correspondences must not be allowed to delude us. We must not imagine that the classical analysis of discourse has continued without modification through the ages, merely by applying itself to a new object, that the force of some historical weight has maintained it in its identity, despite so many adjacent mutations. In fact, the 4 theoretical segments that outline the space of general grammar have not been preserved, but they were dissociated. They changed both their function and their level. They modified the entire domain of their validity when, at the end of the 18th century, the theory of representation was eclipsed. In the classical age, the function of general grammar was to show how a language could be introduced into the sequential chain of representations, a language that, while manifesting itself in the simple and absolutely tenuous line of discourse, presupposed forms of simultaneity, affirmation of existences and coexistences, patterning of things represented, and formation of generalities, original and inerasable relation between words and things, displacement of words within their rhetorical space. In contrast, the analysis of man's mode of being as it has developed since the 19th century does not reside within a theory of representation. Its task, on the contrary, is to show how things in general can be given to representation, in what conditions, upon what ground, within what limits they can appear in a positivity more profound than the various modes of perception, and what is then revealed in this coexistence of man and things through the great spatial expanse opened up by representation is man's radical finitude, the dispersion that at the same time separates him from his origin and promises it to him, and the insuperable distance of time. The analytic of man is not a resumption of the analysis of discourse as constituted elsewhere and handed down by tradition. The presence or absence of a theory of representation, or more exactly, the primary character or derived position of that theory, modifies the equilibrium of the system from top to bottom. As long as representation goes without question as the general element of thought, the theory of discourse serves at the same time and in one and the same movement as the foundation of all possible grammar and as a theory of knowledge. But as soon as the primacy of representation disappears, then the theory of discourse is dissociated, and one can encounter its disincarnated and metamorphosed form on two separate levels. On the empirical level, the four constituent segments are still to be found, but the function they perform has been wholly inverted. Replacing the analysis of the verb's privileged position, of its power to make discourse emerge from itself and become rooted in the being of representation, we find the analysis of an internal grammatical structure, which is immanent in each language and constitutes it as an autonomous being, in other words, upon itself. Similarly, the analysis of the articulation common to words and things has been replaced by the theory of inflections and the attempt to establish laws of mutation proper to words alone. The theory of the radical has been substituted for the analysis of the representative root. Finally, where before there was the search for the boundless continuity of derivation, the lateral kinship of languages has been revealed. In other words, everything that had functioned within the dimension of the relation between things, as they are represented, and words, with their representative value, has now been drawn back into language and given the task of providing it with an internal legality. At foundational level, the four segments of the theory of discourse are still to be found. As in the classical age, they still serve in this new analytic of the human being to express the relation to things. But this time, the modification is the inverse of what it was previously. It is no longer a matter of replacing them in a space interior to language, but of freeing them from the domain of representation within which they were trapped, and of bringing them into play in that dimension of exteriority in which man appears as a finite, determined being, trapped in the density of what he does not think, and subject in his very being to the dispersion of time. From the moment when it was no longer in continuity with the theory of representation, the classical analysis of discourse found itself, as it were, split in two. On the one hand, it invested itself in an empirical knowledge of grammatical forms, and on the other, it became an analytic of finitude. But neither of these two transferences could take place without a total inversion of function. We are now in a position to understand, in all its implications, the incompatibility that reigns between the existence of classical discourse, based upon the unquestioned evidence of representation, and the existence of man as it is presented in modern thought, and with the anthropological reflection that it sanctions. Something like an analytic of man's mode of being became possible only after the analysis of representative discourse had been dissociated, transferred, and inverted. And we can also sense how man's being, thus defined and posited, is weighed down by the contemporary reappearance of language in the enigma of its unity and its being as by a threat. Is the task ahead of us to advance towards a mode of thought, unknown hitherto in our culture, that will make it possible to reflect at the same time, without discontinuity or contradiction, upon man's being and the being of language? If that is so, We must take the very greatest precautions to avoid anything that might be a naive return to the classical theory of discourse, a return all the more tempting, it must be said, because we are so ill-equipped to conceive of the shining but crude being of language, whereas the old theory of representation is there, already constituted, offering us a place in which that being can be lodged and allowed to dissolve into pure function. But the right to conceive both of the being of language and of the being of man may be forever excluded. There may be, as it were, an inerasable hiatus at that point, precisely that hiatus in which we exist and talk, so that it would be necessary to dismiss as fantasy any anthropology in which there was any question of the being of language, or any conception of language or signification which attempted to connect with, manifest, and free the being proper to man. It is perhaps here that the most important philosophical choice of our period has its roots, a choice that can be made only in the test of a future reflection. For nothing can tell us in advance upon which side the through road lies. The only thing we know at the moment, in all certainty, is that in Western culture, the being of man and the being of language have never, at any time, been able to coexist and to articulate themselves one upon the other. Their incompatibility has been one of the fundamental features of our thought. However, the mutation of the analysis of discourse into an analytic of finitude has one other consequence. The classical theory of the sign and the word had to show how representations, which succeeded one another in a chain so narrow and so tightly knit that distinctions did not appear, with the result that they were all, in short, alike, could be spread out to form a permanent table of stable differences and limited identities. It was a matter of a genesis of difference, starting from the secretly varied monotony of the like. The analytic of finitude has an exactly inverse role. In showing that man is determined, it is concerned with showing that the foundation of those determinations is man's very being in its radical limitations. It must also show that the contents of experience are already their own conditions, that thought from the very beginning haunts the unthought that cludes them, and that it is always striving to recover. It shows how that origin of which man is never the contemporary is at the same time withdrawn and given as an immanence. In short, it is always concerned with showing how the other, the distant, is also the near and the same. Thus we have moved from a reflection upon the order of differences, with the analysis it presupposes, and that ontology of continuity and that insistence upon a full, unbroken being deployed in its perfection that presuppose of metaphysics, to a thought of the same, still to be conquered in its contradiction, which implies, apart from the ethics already mentioned, a dialectic in that form of an ontology which, since it has no need of continuity and has to reflect upon being only in its limited forms or in its distance, can and must do without metaphysics. Calling to one another and answering one another throughout modern thought and throughout its history, we find a dialectical interplay and an ontology without metaphysics. For modern thought is one that moves no longer towards the never completed formation of difference, but towards the ever to be accomplished unveiling of the same. Now, such an unveiling is not accomplished without the simultaneous appearance of the double, and that hiatus, minuscule and yet invincible, which resides in the and of retreat and return, of thought and the unthought, of the empirical and the transcendental, of what belongs to the order of positivity and what belongs to the order of foundations. Identity separated from itself by a distance which, in one sense, is interior to it, but in another constitutes it, and repetition which posits identity as a datum, but in the form of distance, are without doubt at the heart of that modern thoughts to which the discovery of time has so hastily been attributed. In fact, if we look a little more closely, we perceive that classical thought related the possibility of spatializing things in a table to that property possessed by pure representative succession to recall itself on the basis of itself, to fold back upon itself, and to constitute a simultaneity on the basis of a continuous time. Time became the foundation of space. In modern thought, what is revealed at the foundation of the history of things and of the historicity proper to man is the distance creating a vacuum within the same. It is the hiatus that disperses and regroups it at the two ends of itself. It is this profound spatiality that makes it possible for modern thought to conceive of time, to know it as succession, to promise it to itself as fulfillment, origin, or return. Part 8, the anthropological sleep. Anthropology, as an analytic of man, has certainly played a constituent role in modern thought, since to a large extent we are still not free from it. It became necessary at the moment when representation lost the power to determine on its own and in a single movement the interplay of its syntheses and analyses. It was necessary for empirical syntheses to be performed elsewhere than within the sovereignty of the I think. They had to be required at precisely the point at which that sovereignty reached its limit, that is, in man's finitude, a finitude that is as much that of consciousness as that of the living, speaking, laboring individual. This had already been formulated by Kant in his Logic, when to his traditional trilogy of questions he added an ultimate one. The three critical questions: what can I know? What must I do? What am I permitted to hope? Then found themselves referred to a fourth, and inscribed, as it were, to its account. Was ist der Mensch? This question, as we have seen, runs through thought from the early 19th century. This is because it produces surreptitiously and in advance the confusion of the empirical and the transcendental, even though Kant had demonstrated the division between them. By means of this question, a form of reflection was constituted, which is mixed in its levels and characteristic of modern philosophy. The concern it has for man, which it lays claim to not only in its discourse but in its pathos, the care with which it attempts to define him as a living being, an individual at work, or a speaking subject, herald the long-awaited return of a human reign only to the high-minded few. In fact, it concerns rather more prosaically and less morally an empirico-critical reduplication, by means of which an attempt is made to make the man of nature, of exchange, or of discourse serve as the foundation of his own finitude. In this fold, the transcendental function is doubled over so that it covers with its dominating network the inert gray space of empiricity. Inversely, empirical contents are given life, gradually pull themselves upright, and are immediately subsumed in a discourse which carries their transcendental presupposition into the distance. And so we find philosophy falling asleep once more in the hollow of this fold, this time not the sleep of dogmatism, but that of anthropology. All empirical knowledge, provided it concerns man, can serve as a possible philosophical field in which the foundation of knowledge, the definition of its limits, and in the end, the truth of all truth must be discoverable. The anthropological configuration of modern philosophy consists in doubling over dogmatism and dividing it into two different levels, each lending support to and limiting the other. The pre-critical analysis of what man is in his essence becomes the analytic of everything that can, in general, be presented to man's experience. In order to awaken thought from such a sleep, so deep that thought experiences it paradoxically as vigilance, so wholly does it confuse the circularity of a dogmatism folded over upon itself in order to find a basis for itself within itself, and the agility and anxiety of a radically philosophical thought. in order to recall it to the possibilities of its earliest dawning, there is no other way than to destroy the anthropological quadrilateral in its very foundations. We know, in any case, that all efforts to think afresh are in fact directed at that obstacle, whether it is a matter of crossing the anthropological field, tearing ourselves free from it with the help of what it expresses, and rediscovering a purified ontology or a radical thought of being, or whether rejecting not only psychologism and historicism, but all concrete forms of the anthropological prejudice, we attempt to question afresh the limits of thought, and to renew contact in this way with the project for a general critique of reason. Perhaps we should see the first attempt at this uprooting of anthropology, to which, no doubt, contemporary thought is dedicated, in the Nietzschean experience, by means of a philological critique, by means of a certain form of biologism. Nietzsche rediscovered the point at which man and God belong to one another, at which the death of the second is synonymous with the disappearance of the first, and at which the promise of the Superman signifies first and foremost the imminence of the death of man. In this, Nietzsche, offering this future to us as both promise and task, marks the threshold beyond which contemporary philosophy can begin thinking again, and he will no doubt continue for a long while to dominate its advance. If the discovery of the return is indeed the end of philosophy, then the end of man, for its part, is the return of the beginning of philosophy. It is no longer possible to think in our day other than in the void left by man's disappearance. For this void does not create a deficiency. It does not constitute a lacuna that must be filled. It is nothing more and nothing less than the unfolding of a space in which it is once more possible to think. Anthropology constitutes perhaps the fundamental arrangement that has governed and controlled the path of philosophical thought from Kant until our own day. This arrangement is essential, since it forms part of our history, but it is disintegrating before our eyes, since we are beginning to recognize and denounce in it, in a critical mode, both a forgetfulness of the opening that made it possible and a stubborn obstacle standing obstinately in the way of an imminent new form of thought. To all those who still wish to talk about man, about his reign or his liberation, to all those who still ask themselves questions about what man is in his essence, to all those who wish to take him as their starting point in their attempts to reach the truth, to all those who, on the other hand, refer all knowledge back to the truths of man himself, to all those who refuse to formalize without anthropologizing, who refuse to mythologize without demystifying, who refuse to think without immediately thinking that it is man who is thinking. To all these warped and twisted forms of reflection, we can answer only with a philosophical laugh, which means, to a certain extent, a silent one.